Welcome to the wonderful fantasy world. Subscribe now. The Mark of the Two Snakes, The Rebirth of the God, Slayer. Volume 1, The Awakening of the Blood Oath. Chapter 19, Gear Black, Market Deal. The night wind in the misty wasteland, carrying the smell of rust, poured into the ventilation ducts of the Gear Black Market. Aiden trudged through the putrid standing water with Lily. The discarded gears kicked by the soles of his boots emitted hollow sounds, forming an eerie harmony with the hammering from the distant gear workshop. After turning through 3 archways made of gear skeletons, the rusty iron door at the end of the dark alley suddenly opened. In the dim yellow glow of the kerosene lamp, the mechanical palm of the former Holy Radiance Knight, Galen, was stuck in the door crack. The sound of the friction of the gear joints was very similar to the execution gallows of the church's night order in Chapter 14 of the prequel. "Don't touch any gears," Galen's hoarse voice came from behind the crow-headed mask. His mechanical eye traced a silver arc in the darkness. "The defensive system of the Divine Palace can track you through the vibration of the gears, unless you want to repeat the Eternal Silence purification operation from 20 years ago." He took a half step back. The skin exposed between the gaps of his breastplate was covered with snake-shaped burn marks. The marks left by Vera's spiritual vein sword in the blood fire siege in Chapter 4 of the prequel, exactly the same as the patterns of the victims Aiden had seen on the murals of the Divine Palace. On the trading platform deep in the black market, the gear lamps flickered in the spiritual vein fluctuations, illuminating the intertwined double snake patterns on the gear key that Galen handed over. Aiden's blood-red eyes activated abruptly. He saw that the church's ciphertext was floating on the surface of the key, and those distorted gear symbols were exactly the Tinguspelt imprints on Loren's design drawing in Chapter 3 of the prequel. This is the access code to the chamber of the first-generation Divine Throne. Galen's mechanical jaw opened and closed, revealing the same gear bearings as Loren's mechanical prosthesis in Chapter 5 of the prequel. 30 years ago, I participated in the reconstruction of the Divine Palace. The gears of each corridor were engraved with the names of alien elders, just like those you saw in the gear graveyard. Lily's gear scanner suddenly beeped. The holographic projection unfolded on the surface of the key, showing the star map coordinates of the previous Divine Throne experiment. Aiden noticed that the core position of the coordinates was exactly the snake-shaped birthmark on the chest of the gallows boy in Chapter 3, the orphan of the Snaketail tribe who lost his parents in the church's raid. Loren's consciousness is still in the core of the Divine Palace. Galen suddenly lowered his voice. The rotation frequency of the gears in his mechanical eye changed suddenly. 3 years ago, I saw his mechanical heart in the gear furnace, still connected to the spiritual vein chains that imprisoned Vera back then. Aiden's fingertips stroked the engravings on the inner side of the key. The pattern of 2 snakes entwining a gear suddenly glowed faintly, resonating with the jade pendant. This was the same pattern he had seen in the Blood Oath blacksmith shop in Chapter 13. His father had mentioned in his diary that this kind of pattern could disrupt the resonance frequency of the Divine Throne core. "Why did you betray the church?" Aiden stared at the snake-shaped scar on Galen's chest, the hideous wound that spread from his left shoulder to his waistline, a trophy from the church's raid on the Snake Tribe in Chapter 4 of the prequel. Galen was silent for a moment, then took off his crow-headed mask. Under the mechanical eye, a faint light seeped out from the seam between the human skin and the gear armor, reflecting the Gear City in his eyes, the mark of the first batch of paladins who underwent gear transformation when Loren signed a contract with the church in Chapter 10 of the prequel. "I saw your father in the misty wasteland 20 years ago." He took out a half-burned parchment from the inside of his breastplate. The WLO5 number on the edge was particularly eye-catching in Aiden's blood-red eyes. He used this key to open the ancient tree chamber where there were fragments of the Divine Throne core that Vera failed to destroy back then. Aiden took the parchment and found it was the design drawing of the gear corridors of the previous Divine Throne experiment. Each gear node was marked with the name of an alien elder. When his fingertips touched the name Vera, the grandmother of the rescued boy in Chapter 3, the drawing suddenly showed blood-colored spelled texts, exactly the same as the patterns on the gear gauntlet that old Tom held tightly before his death in Chapter 2. The gear corridors of the Divine Palace will close faster according to the acceleration of the heartbeat. Only the unimprinted ones, those not contaminated by the church's gear spell imprints, can pass through safely. Galen's mechanical palm pressed on the trading platform, and a three-dimensional maze emerged on the surface of the gear. Lily suddenly tugged at Aiden's cuff. Abnormal spiritual vein frequencies were jumping on her goggles. The resonance waves of these gears are the same as the emotion collectors in the confessional in Chapter 22. They're absorbing fear. Aiden then noticed that on the wrists of the refugees huddled in the corner of the black market, the gear spell imprints were emitting a faint light of the same frequency as the core of the Divine Palace, just like the energy ripples when the Eternal Silence core was activated in Chapter 6 of the prequel. Loren left a backup in the core of the Divine Throne. Galen pointed to the gear furnace in the distance, from where came the sound of turning gears identical to that of the Eternal Silence disaster in Chapter 7 of the prequel. Each gear spell imprint is his eye, and your mother... He suddenly paused, and noise flashed in his mechanical eye. Irene Blood, she wasn't an ordinary gear technician, was she? Aiden's pupils contracted. This was exactly the alias his mother left in the church's files. Galen took out a gear pendant from the hidden compartment of his belt. Inside was engraved the same double snake disassembly diagram as in his father's diary in Chapter 30. I saw her in the blacksmith shop 20 years ago. The fragments of her snake scale armor could make the gear spell, imprints, ineffective. Just like what you're doing now. The dent on the surface of the pendant was clearly the notch of the snake-headed sword during the confrontation of the two snakes in Chapter 5 of the prequel. Suddenly, the rumble of gear armors came from afar. The searchlights of the church patrols swept across the entrance of the black market. Galen suddenly stuffed the key into Aiden's palm. Go through the ventilation duct. The gear set at the end is engraved with 777. That's the experimental subject number when your mother was imprisoned. He tore off his cloak, revealing the energy track tattoo on his back identical to that in the decisive battle of the two snakes in Chapter 8 of the prequel. Tell Mara that it's time for the blood pattern on the red snake pottery cup to come in handy. Before Aiden could ask further, Galen's mechanical palm had pressed on the gear mechanism on the wall. The entire wall suddenly flipped, revealing a secret passage engraved with pre-era characters. Remember in the gear furnace on the third floor of the Divine Palace, Loren's mechanical heart is still connected to the chains that extracted Vera's spiritual veins back then? Galen's voice gradually weakened in the sound of turning gears. The time your father bought with the war puppet is only enough for you to find the three weaknesses of the core. The alarm suddenly rang and the gear door began to close. Aiden tightly held the key and found that the tooth patterns fit perfectly into the groove on the back of the jade pendant, the symbiotic spell imprint engraved by Vera before petrification in Chapter 9 of the prequel. Lily suddenly pointed at the mural in the secret passage. Look, it's the relief of the pre-era Stargate. On the rock wall, in the center of the pattern of two snakes entwining a gear, the WO5 number, identical to that of the gallows gear in Chapter 3, was engraved, and the coordinates of the Stargate were exactly the position pointed by the afterimage of his father that emerged from the tree hole of the ancient tree in Chapter 8. At the end of the secret passage was a gear elevator. The moment Aiden inserted the key into the groove, his mother's smiling face appeared on the surface of the gear, the expression she had when she turned around on the stake in the heart, burning choice in Chapter 12. In the tremor when the elevator started, Aiden's blood-red eyes saw fragments of the future, himself standing in front of the gear furnace, the wrench left by his father being inserted into the core of Loren's mechanical heart, while Galen's mechanical eye was staring intently at his back. He's lying. The voice of the remnant soul Vera suddenly sounded in the jade pendant, carrying the aftertaste of the sacred song from the spiritual vein ceremony in Chapter 2 of the prequel. Galen's gear key is engraved with the church's tracking spell imprint, just like the gear pendant Loren gave me back then. Aiden woke up suddenly and found that the double snake pattern on the inner side of the key was seeping silver light, the unique spiritual vein tracking technique of the church during the gear strangulation in Chapter 3 of the prequel. Lily's scanner suddenly emitted a shrill alarm. Energy reaction. It's Selene's holy lance. The gear door exploded. The gear armors of the church knights shattered the standing water. The pattern of two snakes entwining a gear on the tip of the lance was exactly the same as Loren's God Slayer weapon in Chapter 8 of the prequel. Aiden slapped the key into Lily's hand. Go to the ancient tree chamber. There's the core of the war puppet left by my father. When he turned around, he saw Galen being pressed against the gear wall by 3 knights, and the rotation frequency of the gears in his mechanical eye was squealing. Aiden! Galen roared in the rumble of the gear gallows. The gear crown on the top floor of the Divine Palace is the real carrier of Loren's consciousness. A red snake pattern suddenly emerged on his chest, resonating with Aiden's mark. Back then, your mother exposed her identity on purpose to make the church think that the blood of the 2 snakes was cut off. The moment the silver light of the Holy Lance stabbed over, Aiden's blood, red eyes caught the gear cracks above Galen's head. 3 cracks corresponded to the failures of the first 3 vessel awakenings. He suddenly remembered the beacon left by Selene in Chapter 7. The mechanical gear emblem in the center was exactly the same as the mark inside Galen's armor, the mark of the vessel of Loren's consciousness. You've known I would come. Aiden dodged the fatal blow sideways. The wrench turned into the afterimage of a snake-headed sword in the red snake spiritual light. Galen, or should I say, the 9th vessel Loren? The mechanical armor shattered, revealing the half-human, half-gear body underneath. Galen's mechanical jaws split open, and Loren's voice, mixed with the sound of gear friction, spilled out. So perceptive, Aiden. The double snake pattern your father engraved in the blacksmith shop is actually the activation code of the Divine Throne core. His mechanical heart suddenly expanded, revealing the spiritual vein crystal of Vera sealed inside. And your blood is the key to unlock the code. Aiden's blood-red eyes saw that the blood-colored spell text flowing on the surface of the crystal were exactly the control codes Loren engraved on the spiritual vein crystal in the Prelude to Eternal Silence in Chapter 6. When the Holy Lance stabbed again, he suddenly inserted the key into the crack of the crystal. The resonance between the gear key and the jade pendant shattered the entire wall. Among the falling gear fragments, he saw the last smile on Galen, or rather Loren's consciousness, exactly the same as the mechanical fluctuations in the bishop's pupils in the gallows square in Chapter 3. The gear furnace at the end of the secret passage had been activated. Aiden tightly held the wrench left by his father, feeling the resonance of gears and spiritual veins in his palm. Galen's words before his death echoed in his mind. The gear crown on the top floor of the Divine Palace ... double quotes. And his blood-red eyes were seeing the double snake pattern engraved on the base of the crown, exactly the same as the pattern on the jade pendant picked up by the team leader of the inspection team in Chapter 1. Lily's voice came from the communicator, tinged with sobs. The ancient tree chamber has been found. There's a video in the core of the war puppet. Your father and Loren, they were partners in the symbiote experiment. Aiden's fingertips traced the engravings on the inner side of the key. He suddenly understood why Galen knew his mother's true identity. In his father's blacksmith shop log, the WL07 experimental subject erased by the church was exactly the symbiotic vessel created with Vera's spiritual veins. The heat from the gear furnace rushed towards him. Aiden stared at the mechanical heart suspended in the center and finally understood that the intertwined gear chains were exactly the materialization of Vera's spiritual vein chains during the confrontation of the 2 snakes in Chapter 5 of the prequel. When he placed his palm on the core, in the red and silver light emitted by the double snake mark, he saw the scene 20 years ago. His father, holding the same gear key, confronted Loren's mechanical consciousness in the secret chamber of the Divine Palace, while the fragments of his mother's snake-scale armor were quietly lying on the base of the gear crown. "So, you've been ready to make me a vessel," Aiden murmured, feeling the heartbeat of the mechanical heart synchronize with his own pulse. It was the sound of the gears in the blacksmith shop and the lonely shadow in the mist in Chapter 13, the heartbeat of his mother before her death, and also the first resonance of gears and spiritual veins when the 2 snakes were first born 100 years ago. The sounds of the scuffle in the gear black market gradually faded away. Aiden knew that Galen's betrayal was just the tip of the iceberg of the church's conspiracy. He looked at the gear key in his hand. Its tooth patterns were absorbing the spiritual vein energy of the furnace, gradually revealing pre-era characters. To the 7th generation vessel, when the gears stop turning, the Reaper behind the Stargate will wake up. Below this line were engraved the same snake tribe runes as those on the petrified ancient tree in Chapter 9. and the weight of the key suddenly became exactly the same as the gear pocket watch left by his mother. Aiden put the key into his backpack and heard Lily say on the communicator that the war puppet in the ancient tree chamber had been activated and was playing his father's last message. Find the gear crown. That's Loren's last weakness hidden in the church. The gears of the furnace began to rotate in reverse. Aiden turned and walked towards the direction of the divine palace. The double snake mark on his back was burning hot, as if the remnant souls of Vera and Loren were whispering in the roar of the gears. He knew that Galen's true identity might forever remain a mystery, but the key in his palm at this moment was not only the access permit to the divine palace, but also the key to uncovering the century-old lie of the mark of the two snakes, just as his father wrote in the log. Gears and blood have never been a curse but a choice. The moment he stepped out of the black market, the blood-colored moon in the misty wasteland just rose to the top of the gear tower, stretching his shadow very long. In that shadow, the patterns of gears and snakes were blending, just like the last embrace of Vera and Loren at the top of the divine throne 100 years ago, and also like the last smile of his mother when she turned around on the stake, with snake scales and gear spell imprints intertwined. This episode ends here. The next episode will be more exciting. Subscribe now.